Ezra Pound is the most controversial literary figure of our time. The same man who edited the work of Yeats and T.S. Eliot helped introduce the poetry of Robert Frost and influenced the development of Hemingway, was also tried for treason and sent to an insane asylum. Eustace Mullins, for the first time, presents the case for Ezra Pound, documenting the tremendous contribution Pound has made to contemporary American culture in a witty and biting criticism of our society, which gives lip service to poetry while imprisoning its major poet. In an intensely personal, unforgettable portrait of Ezra Pound, Mullins tackles the questions at the heart of the lifetime of controversy and acrimony that has surrounded, encircled, and finally enclosed Ezra Pound. From Mullins's vivid writing emerges a portrait of Ezra Pound as an eccentric genius, a literary leader who is both outrageously outspoken and unquenchably exuberant, a man who was kind when he wanted to be and quarrelsome when his beliefs were questioned. This difficult individual, Ezra Pound. Mullins has documented Pound's crash into the Victorian literary world of London in the 1920s, his membership in the expatriate Bohemia of Paris, the earlier quiet years in Rapallo, and the later tumultuous ones. Included in This Difficult Individual, Ezra Pound, are excerpts from the controversial broadcasts Pound made from Italy during World War II. The whole record of what happened when Pound, under indictment for treason and committed to an asylum, received the official Bollingen Prize for Poetry from a jury of America's best-known poets, and the unforgettable record of Pound's incommunicado imprisonment in a ruthless iron cage by the American army after his surrender in Italy. From This Difficult Individual, Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound was the only Bohemian of the Second World War. In a world gone mad, he continued to cry out, "Stop it! Stop it!" He has never raised his hand against another human being. Pound was duly indicted for treason, but the chief complaint against him seems to have been that he refused to take part in the slaughter. While so many millions were dipping their hands in blood, he asked only for peace. His purpose was serious, although the result was disastrous for him. The fury against Pound, which is still unabated in many quarters, stems from the fact that he refused to become a barbarian. Almost alone of Western men, he has no blood on his conscience. All the photographs of Pound, his wife, and friends in this book were taken by the author during Pound's imprisonment and shortly after his release. These are rare portraits of the poet in his later years. The jacket photo, reproduced in the book, is considered by Pound to be the best likeness ever made of him. Drop in someday at your convenience to discuss This Difficult Individual, Ezra Pound. Christian Herder, Under-Secretary of State, in a letter to Dr. Winfred Overholster, Superintendent of St. Elizabeth's Hospital, January 2nd, 1958. The loftiest rise of land in that territorial oddity known as the District of Columbia is occupied by an insane asylum. I have not been able to ascertain what humorist in the victorious federal government, immediately following the Civil War, selected this dominant ground for the site of St. Elizabeth's Hospital, so that the employees of the various departments could look up as they emerged from their offices at the close of the day and see in the distance the solemn brick buildings of that Valhalla of the government clerk, the madhouse. In 1949, I was introduced to the poet Ezra Pound, who was at that time an inmate of St. Elizabeth's Hospital. There had been conflicting reports as to his mental condition, that is to say, the reports of the government psychiatrists and the reports of everyone else who knew him. The hospital officials avoided the issue by describing him to prospective visitors quite honestly as a political prisoner. In the interest of national security, Pound was being kept under guard by the Federal Bureau of Health, Education, and Welfare. I also was a ward of the government. My status as a veteran of the Second World War had won me paid subsistence at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in Washington. In those days, the institute housed the sad remnants of the avant-garde in America. It was inevitable that the name of Ezra Pound, who for nearly half a century had personified all that was new and daring in the fine arts, should be mentioned there, although its directors preferred the work of one of Pound's earliest discoveries, T.S. Eliot. In 1948, a reception had been held at the Institute in honor of Eliot, who had just been awarded the Nobel Prize, as have several of Pound's students, although he himself has been passed by repeatedly. At this reception, I had first seen Ezra, Pound's wife, Dorothy Shakespeare Pound, who appeared briefly, acquired by Eliot in his most high episcopal manner. Squired. At this reception, I had first seen Ezra Pound's wife, Dorothy Shakespeare Pound, who appeared briefly, squired by Eliot in his most high episcopal manner. True to his calling, Pound had not allowed a treason indictment or a cell in a madhouse to interfere drastically with his work. He was translating the Confucian Odes. One of the students at the institute was also a nurse at St. Elizabeth's. Like many other members of the staff, she had peeked at Pound's confidential file, although this was nominally forbidden. My fellow student informed me that Ezra was a source of considerable annoyance to his captors, as his doctors were sometimes called. Not only had he refused treatment, quote unquote, as the doctors termed their excursions into barbarism, but he would not take part in the activities of the hospital. In reality, persons under observation for mental illness are immediately deprived of all their civil rights, a dilemma that the writers of the Constitution unfortunately overlooked. It has been very simple for bureaucrats to designate their critics as being, quote, mentally ill, unquote, and to shut them away from the eyes of the world in the various bastilles that have been built for that purpose. No one dares to intervene on behalf of a person who is, quote, mentally ill, unquote. It is much safer to be a communist or a hoodlum. The sculptor John B. Flanagan, who was a patient at Bloomingdale Hospital in New York, reputedly one of the best in the country, wrote of his experiences, there are actually more legal safeguards for a felon than checks on the psychiatrist to whom civil liberty is a joke. The superintendent of St. Elizabeth's, Dr. Winfred Overholster, was a genial type who wished the patients to help him create the atmosphere of a YMCA. 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 Summer camp. But the assorted rapists, dope addicts, and political prisoners refused to cooperate. The staff employed the latest methods of therapy, which were constantly changing, such as acting out one's repressions, without weapons, of course, for those who wish to write. A category that includes everyone suspected of mental illness. A mimeographed journal called St. Elizabeth's Sunshine was circulated among the patients. The doctors were peeved because Ezra would not contribute to this journal, and the nurse informed me that they had marked him down as uncooperative. This is the most serious charge that can be lodged against an inmate of a mental institution. Despite the fact that it is a federal institution and much more amply budgeted than comparable state hospitals, St. Elizabeth's is a heart-breaking and appalling bedlam. Visiting doctors from other countries are seldom asked to tour it. For they would doubtless be horrified. The dank, dark buildings reek of the foul stench of a century's urine. I once dined in the employees' cafeteria and was ill for 2 days. It seemed impossible for me to get the smell of the place out of my system. The medical techniques used at St. Elizabeth's are regarded as incredibly backward and inhumane by more advanced European physicians, although the members of the staff no longer cure, quote, mental illness, unquote, by removing the entire large intestine. This was a popular remedy there until the Second World War. The superstitious doctors of several decades ago, believed that mental disorder was caused by bacteria in the gut. The bacteria that in reality are responsible for the osmotic digestive process. The operation had no visible effect on the patient's mental capacities, but more than 80% of them died from its after effects. The staff at St. Elizabeth's is also quite excited about a cure that has been in vogue in the Congo. For some 20,000 years, according to such anthropologists as Frobenius. This is a method for relieving mental illness by splitting open the skull and removing part of the brain. The operation is known as lobotomy. European physicians have denounced this process as excessively barbaric, as well as demonstrably worthless in the treatment of mental illness. But it is still employed by the federal psychiatrists and surgeons. A more recent treatment, electric shock, was blithely described by A more recent treatment, electric shock, was blithely described by Dr. Overholster in an interview published in the U.S. News and World Report, November 18th, 1955. An electric current is passed between the temples and causes a period of unconsciousness with very violent convulsive movements. Isn't it just like getting electrocuted? The interviewer asked. There's a certain amount of risk. Dr. Overholster replied, I think rather slight. But there is some risk to it. What does it do? How does it cure them? We don't know. It's entirely empirical. The electric shock treatment is very closely allied to the practice of electrocution as a capital punishment, with the difference the murderers are only electrocuted once. But those accused of mental illness have to endure 3 or more shocks on consecutive days. Electrodes are strapped onto the patient's temples and he is bombarded with currents, not quite powerful enough to cause death. A patient who has been, quote-unquote, cured by this treatment assured me that it was one of the most terrifying experiences that anyone can undergo. Dr. Overholster concluded the interview by pointing out that there was no longer any stigma attached to those who had been inmates of mental hospitals. Dr. Overholser concluded the interview by pointing out that there was no longer any stigma attached to those who had been inmates of mental hospitals. He said proudly, "We have a great many of our patients who go back to work in government agencies." The statistics on the numbers of government workers in Washington who have histories of mental illness have been suppressed. One of my fellow students at the institute was a lady who had undergone a lobotomy. She constantly complained that she was going to sue the doctor, a resolve that we encouraged, but by the time she had reached the doctor's office, she always would forget why she had come. She was employed at the White House during the Truman administration, but I do not believe that she held a policy-making position. Ezra was not forced to undergo either the lobotomy or the electric shock treatment while he was imprisoned at St. Elizabeth. His worldwide reputation as a poet perhaps protected him. His worldwide reputation as a poet perhaps protected him from such ordeals. The electric shock technique had received some unfavorable publicity at the Nuremberg trials, when inmates of Nazi concentration camps testified that they had been forced to submit to this treatment. In her book Hitler's Ovens, Olga Lengyel says that she employed the ruse of insanity to escape from Auschwitz and visit her husband at Buna. She was included in a convoy of mentally ill inmates who were being sent to Buna for this treatment, and she describes the reception there. The mentally sick were led into an experimental room. There, under the surveillance of a German doctor, they were injected with a new product intended to produce a shock in the nervous system. The reactions were noticed with much care. While these experiments were going on, our SS guards were eating and drinking in the German medical director's office. I was able to rejoin my husband. Psychiatrists comprise a fascinating group for future study in the field of mental disorder. Dr. Overholser's predecessor at St. Elizabeth's had been shot dead by his wife while he was sitting in an automobile with his mistress in front of a fashionable dress shop on Washington's F Street. A few months later, a series of brutal muggings and rapes committed by employees of St. Elizabeth's had moved a Washington editor to complain that the attendants should be locked up at night with the patients and that they should not be allowed to come into the city. When a creative personality falls into their clutches, the psychiatrists run about like chickens in the shadow of the hawk's wing. Pound's records were constantly being pawed by curious doctors and attendants. And when in 1949 a souvenir hunter on the staff absconded with a large part of his case history, the remainder of the tattered file was placed in a safe. Dr. Overholser parries all inquiries about it with the standard reply: "These are confidential government papers and cannot be shown to anyone. No, anyone. These are confidential government papers and cannot be shown to anyone." John Flanagan wrote of his Bloomingdale experience to his friend Carl Sigrosser in December 1934. Psychiatric sophistry finds I've been too interested in my work. Psychiatric sophistry finds I've been too interested in my work. It should have a less dominant place in my life, and my life no longer seems my own. It is a favorite theme of the psychiatrist, this notion that the creative artist is a mentally ill, compulsive manic depressive with a non-controllable personality disorder. Non-controllable personality disorder. Non-controllable personality disorder. Non-controllable personality disorder. He must be, quote unquote, adjusted. Once he has been adjusted to society, he will no longer feel the urge to write fine poetry or to create splendid music. Instead, he will settle down to a, quote unquote, normal living. He will turn out knickknacks for the dime stores or write verses for the community newspaper, as Pound was asked to do at St. Elizabeth's. The psychiatrist fears, above all else, the healthy cleansing effect of the creative personality upon society. The psychiatrist fears, above all else, the healthy cleansing effect of the creative personality upon society. The psychiatrist fears, above all else, the healthy cleansing effect of the creative personality upon society. During Pound's imprisonment, American editorial writers were carried away by an exhilarating sense of freedom whenever they mentioned him. He was a federal prisoner and in no position to sue for libel, so he was a tempting target. The jackals of the press usually described them by such epithets as the crazy traitor, the convicted traitor, or the mad poet. Not only was it libelous to term him a traitor when he had not been convicted of treason, let alone tried, but the continued usage of such terms by the press over a period of years made it impossible to assure him a fair trial. Not only was it libelous to term him a traitor when he had not been convicted of treason, let alone tried, but the continued usage of such terms, 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 the continued usage of such terms by the press, for over a period of years, made it impossible to assure him a fair trial. Public opinion, public opinion, public opinion, public opinion, public opinion, public opinion, public opinion was carefully schooled to believe that he was guilty without having been tried. Carefully schooled to believe that he was guilty without having been tried.